You all know Wendy. Wendy Miller is, I am honored to have Wendy Miller as a mother-in-law, and also honored to have her daughter as my wife, Heidi. And Heidi and I live in community together here with Ed and Wendy. Wendy grew up in England, was part of the Church of England eventually. Not right when you were born, right?
No, that was when I
Was
was
it
born.
right away? Mm-hmm. Okay, and she was born in 1938, so prior to World War II, but as war was ramping up in the world, a world crisis, and we know something of world crisis right now. So we're going to talk about that and some of her experiences that she remembers, and that how, as she reflected on those experiences, what comes up at this time when we face some crisis. Certainly different than a military war, but some similarities as well. So could you start off, Wendy, by just telling us about what you remember about the town where you were born? It's the town where there was a castle called Pevensey that was built by the Romans,
Right.
But has quite a history within England and quite a history in your story.
Yeah. So I was born in a little village called West Ham, which is west of Pevensey Castle. And as Gary just said, that was built by the Romans in the 3rd century. And in those days, the sea, the English Channel, came right up to where the castle was. Over centuries, the amount of silt and sand and so forth that came down with rivers and stuff into the sea, then it filled in that whole area. And so the area now around Pevensey is called Pevensey Flats. It's very flat. And it's about 22 miles across, east to west. And on the west, you have Eastbourne, which is another town that'll come up in my story. And that nestles up against the South Downs, which drop off into the English Channel in the form of these white chalk cliffs. And on the east, then this Hastings, another city, which is built on top of the hills there with cliffs. And as you go further along, you get to the cliffs of Dover. And so between Hastings and Eastbourne, you have this flat area. And West Ham then is about 5 miles or so west of Eastbourne. It's a little village. It nestles up against Pevensey Castle, and Pevensey is on the other side, a little village of its own, ancient villages. And in both of those villages, there is a Norman church, St. Nicholas Church and St. Mary's Church. And when there was an invasion of England in 1066, the chief invader was given permission to invade England in order to re-Christianize it, because Christianity had been wiped out by the Vikings, as long as they built churches. And so the earliest Norman church then was built in that area, right in that area. And then there's another one in West Ham, one in Pevensey, and that was built in about 14, 16 years after the invasion in 1066. Very historic towns. And it was in St. Mary's Church where I was baptized into the Church of England.
Not in 1066, though.
No.
No. Okay.
1938. Yeah.
So tell us about, you mentioned to me earlier today about remembering the trucks coming down the street and making announcements. Tell us about that.
Okay. I don't remember this because I was like, 18 months old. But my mother tells the story. My mother was a story keeper in our family. And she said that these trucks came through West Ham, Pevensey, all up and down the streets with loudspeakers. And the loudspeakers were announcing that everyone needed to leave because of the rumblings of war. The German forces were now positioned all along the European coast, France, Belgium, so forth. And that's only 35 miles away from the English coast. If you get to where the cliffs of Dover are, it's just 21 miles. And so they were going to move in then military into all the houses in that area, including ours. And then they would be building a defense along the beaches. So that would have been when I was 18 months old. And my father's father, my grandfather, Tom Hill, had grown up in Herefordshire, which is up tucked away near to Wales, and was a horticulturist. His father was a farmer, and his father before him. And so we moved then to Herefordshire when I was 18 months, and my dad moved his business there. And his business was to design and manufacture tools, specialized tools for specialized reasons. For like Rolls-Royce needed tools to fix their cars in those days, or for the war it became fixing planes, Spitfires, fixing special tanks and things like this. This is what his job was.
So you had to move out of there, and so you moved to Bromyard?
Yes, Bromyard.
And tell us a story about so you're trying to move away from where the war was, and in your history, the war seemed to follow you. And your mother had a special story, or you remember a story of your mother trying to prepare the house for war.
This is true. So just like with the coronavirus, the mayor or the governor or the federal government will give instructions as to what people are to do. And one of the instructions, the rules were, in England at that time, was that you had to black out, which meant you had to have black, thick curtains in your windows. And if you had a skylight, you needed to paint that glass black so that at nighttime, there would be no light whatsoever. And if enemy forces flew over, they couldn't see where a town was. And so in Bromyard then, they found this long building that had all these skylights along the top. And my mother then got up this ladder, and she had sewn curtains for the other windows. And then she had this black paint and a paintbrush, and she climbs up on this roof, and she's trying to paint these windows so that they're covered in black. And, and so one of them was especially greasy, and the paint just wouldn't stick. And she just felt really troubled. She thought, no, what can I do about this? And it was in the fall, and the leaves had turned color, and they were being blown off the trees. And she said this huge wind came along and started blowing leaves off the ground in the trees, and they started sticking to this window. And finally, the leaves formed a blackout. She thought, good, good, good. And so she climbed back down the ladder, and she went inside, made herself a hot cup of tea. That's what Britishers do always after something.
cup of tea at the end.
That's right.
So you weren't there very long. Your dad got moved because of his business. He got moved to London to make tools for the war effort. And so the family moves to London, which is going to become the center of the war.
It's the epicenter.
Yeah.
It's like moving to New York.
Like moving to New York City or Detroit right now, right?
Yeah.
So tell us about life in London, and especially about this special dining room table that you had.
Yeah. One of the other rules we had is that everyone was expected to have a shelter. So just as we're trying to keep safe from the coronavirus, right? During the war, how would people get safe in their own homes? And so some persons excavated in their backyards and would build a shelter with special roofing and everything. Other people in London would go to the underground, to the tube. You can go down 4 stories down, and there's underground railroads there called the tube, so it's very safe down there. My dad, because he was very aware of what could happen with steel, he ordered and had installed a steel table shelter. And it was the size of a double bed in our dining room, and had 4 very sturdy legs, also steel. And I remember the edges were sharp. They were very square. I mean, Derek and I would play hide and seek, either side of this thing, bopping up and down while waiting for a meal. He hit his head on one of those edges there and cut himself. He was bleeding. We had to be really careful with these edges. And underneath them, on the floor level, there was a mattress, bed springs installed, and then a double bed mattress. So if we needed to, during the night when there were air raids, my parents would carry us down and we'd all get into that bed during the air raid and we could sleep in there. And so it was a table shelter with a bed shelter, and it was inside the house.
Now you talk about standing at the doorway of that dining room and watching the sky. Tell us about that.
Okay, so our dining room, the windows were actually French doors, and they looked out into our backyard. And so you could see through up to the sky. And here I was, 4.5, 5 years old, and you pick up on certain language that your parents speak. It's like parents speak about the war. And so I saw this, what looked like a little plane flying kind of this way. And I said to my mom, I says, is that one of theirs or one of ours? That was the jargon. And she looked and she says, she said, that's one of theirs. But she wasn't a bit perturbed about it. And I don't remember any air raid siren going on either. I'm sure there must have been one blown. But we were standing there and she said, that's a V1. And a V1 was a self-propelled bomb that didn't have any people flying it. It was all programmed. And she says, flying over there, so it's not going to hit us. She said it goes in a straight line. And she says, when it finally runs out of gas or whatever it is, she says, then it just drops where it is. She says, flying that way, so she's not going to hit us. We're fine. And she said this so, what shall I say, like, oh yeah, there's a bird flying by. Don't worry about that. That kind of, attitude of no fear, no anxiety. And I just knew we were safe. Later things changed and it wasn't safe. So I think in the coronavirus, to start with, there were people over there, and we were over here, and it didn't feel so bad. But after a while, it encroached. Mm-hmm. We began to realize it's much worse than we thought.
Mm-hmm. So how about just the routine of life, like going to school? You walked to school every day. You were 5 years old, and you would walk to school in London during the war. What was like that? What was that like?
Okay, so all of life, on the one hand, was normal. On the other hand, you had in London all the air raids. So we had air raids early in the morning, very often over breakfast. And then as people went to work, depending on what time they went to work. And so then I was to walk to school, and it was a long block and a half to the grade school where I went. And so my mother told me, and this is what children were instructed to do. She said, if the air raid siren goes off while you're walking to school, she says, you walk up to the door of the nearest house, and it was a residential area. She says, you knock on their door and you tell them that you're going to school, but there's an air raid. Could you share their shelter? And when it's over, she says, you keep just walking to school. I never had to do that. But when I look back, I think, oh my God, I can't imagine telling Heidi or one of my children when they're 5 to do that, right? We live in a very different world. So in school then, if the air raid siren went off, and it did, the school also had shelters, and a shelter for each class in the grade school. And the teacher, if the air raid siren went off, would say, she'd say, now pick up your book. And she says, put your finger in the book, in the page where we're reading. And she says, get in single file, and we'll walk to the shelter in silence. And you get to the shelter, and you find your place in the shelter and sit down. And then she says, now open your book. And we just carry right on the class as if we were in the classroom. There were lights in the shelter so you could see. And when the air raid, all clear, it was called, the all clear sounded, when there was a raid coming, it would go up and down. That was a warning. When it was all clear, it was just a steady sound. And she would say, okay, put your finger in the page now. So if it was 27 before, now it's 42 or something. She says, hold the finger in the book, stand up, get in a single file, we'll walk in silence back to the classroom. And we'd sit down and she said, now open your page, open your book at 42, and we'd continue right on having class. There was never any screaming, running, shouting, panic. This was British, what shall I say, kind of, have you heard the term carry on London? Okay, this was carry on London. You just do what you need to do. No drama. And so that's how we did it.
Yeah. So all these experiences, you were 5, and so, you're looking back on that now. And you've looked back on that your whole life and put that in different ways of understanding. How did that, or did that shape your faith journey in any way?
One of the things that my mother did as a story keeper would be to tell stories of her childhood and on through. And later, when I was older, I asked her to write them down, and I brought some memoirs together. And God language was hidden and tucked away in her stories. As a family, we didn't attend church. The only time we ever attended church together was when my youngest brother Tom was born after the war, and we all went to his christening or his baptism. That's the only time we attended church together. Otherwise, no prayer, no grace. Forgiveness was not a word I ever knew. The Bible wasn't a book that you finally had. We just were not a Christian family, although we were Anglican. So you're very, very nominal, 2 or 4 times removed type of thing. What I began to discover in my mom's stories, that the God word would come up, and that her mother had memorized certain passages of scripture. And so my mom's dad, my grandfather Friedrich, was first of all in the Navy, then the Merchant Navy. And later he was in the Life Guard. And she was always away at sea. And so my mother would tell stories of her mother Sophia, that she would fix this picnic. And she put everything in the stroller or in the pram. It's the perambulator. And Rodney was the littlest one, so he'd be in there, and she'd have all the food in there. And would you believe she would make caramel apples from scratch? And that was part of the picnic. And then they'd walk all the way out the seafront and then up onto the downs, which drop off in these cliffs. And they'd sit on the top of the downs where you could see the sea. And then while they were there, then she would recite the 121st Psalm. When I lift up my eyes to the hills, where does my help come from? It comes from the Lord. And she would just recite the whole psalm, which is the traveler's psalm. And I realized as I listened to her stories that her mother carried faith, that she, in a sense, was praying as she sat by the sea with her children. Other times when my mom's mother died, when my mother was 12, of kidney failure, my mother said some maiden aunts, which were the stepsisters of my grandfather Friedrich, she said appeared out of nowhere, and they sewed then clothes for the funeral for the children, black clothes and so on. They were all seamstresses. And they said, we pray for you every day. And I began to hear these nuggets of faith. And my mother carried a faith inside her, but she never talked about it. It came out in story. And it was when I was in school that scripture lessons were required in the British school system at that time, public schools. So that's when we had prayers in the morning, Bible reading, singing hymns. And I loved the music. And so I began to be warmed toward this God who was in the scriptures and the stories of the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, after the war, we lived in Eastbourne, and Derek and I were sent to Sunday school just around the corner from where we lived, a very short, walk, probably 30 yards. And wonderful Sunday school teacher who taught us through the lens of story. And she'd tell the Bible story in a way we could understand. And then we'd have some discussion. And she says, now I want you to go home. And she says, paint a picture or draw a picture of what you saw in the story. And I just love to do that. So I draw the Bible story. And that's how I began to ease into faith. During the war, otherwise, it wasn't there. It wasn't like my parents listened to a church service or prayed or...
But you did mention that the radio
Yes.
was a big piece.
It was.
And that the BBC addressed spirituality in some fashion.
They did.
Yeah.
I found out later, I was too young at the time to know, Scott, who is on with us, gave me a book for my birthday, and it was C.S. Lewis in World War II. And it gives the backstory of British Broadcasting Company, BBC, and how that this smaller operation with the war burgeoning said we need to be a good voice for the people and for the military. And we need to enlarge what we do. And they had a vision of 4 things they would do then. One was to do good news, not happy good news, but news that was thoroughly correct, well spoken, news that would be honest and forthright, but trustworthy. And so information sharing. And then they wanted music, classical music, opera music, popular music. Then they wanted good drama. So you would have dramas. And some of them were, I remember Mrs. Dale's diary, the diary of a doctor's wife. And you heard this was a drama. And then the last one was spirituality. They wanted to care for the soul of the people. So they were trying to find a voice. They were trying to find a person that could speak spiritual language, but not be too churchy and religious. And finally, they ran into C.S. Lewis. Some of you may know that writer. And persuaded him finally, to come from Oxford down to London to record his 15-minute segments in the middle of the war. So he did.
So I had the honor of accompanying the family 2 summers ago to England, where you brought us around to the different places where you lived. And it was really, as we moved around from the lower coast in London, it's a story of journey in emergency and in evacuation. It's like, let's go here to be safe. Oh, it's not safe. Let's go here. Oh, it's not safe. Let's go here. Oh, it's not safe. And so this bang, bang, bang. That's not the right word to use, but the story of evacuation and quarantine. So how is that shaped, or how do you relate what's happening to us today, where we're all, we're not evacuating, we're not, although some folks are evacuating, but we're sheltering in place, which is kind of a quarantine-ish evacuation. How does your experience inform you today?
It helps me put the coronavirus kind of to hold the coronavirus within the kind of wartime experience for me, and also vice versa. As Heidi mentioned in her message on Sunday morning, during the war when we lived in London, I came down with scarlet fever, and I was very, very sick. I got delirious, and so was taken to the hospital at the middle of the night by ambulance. And there was very poor communication in those days between nurses and doctors and children. And so it wasn't given any orientation, any instructions, nothing at all. Nurses would come and make your bed or whatever it was in silence. And I was too shy to ask. And my mother, because I was so delirious, had not been able to say to me, now, when you get to the hospital, if you need anything, you can always ask. So all of that was missing. But I was quarantined. So just like someone gets coronavirus now and they're quarantined, for 2 weeks at home, I was quarantined in the hospital for 3 weeks. And in some places in the United States, people are quarantined in a special hospital area or waiting area where the hospitalized people aren't, they're really ill, but the ones who are tested positive but don't have bad symptoms yet, to keep them away from other people so they don't catch it. So I was quarantined in a ward with, 25 of the kids. We all had scarlet fever for 3 weeks. And it was a way of keeping everyone safe from this really swarming through. So I look at that as, that's very similar to what's happening today, very similar. And I know that when I got home, my toys weren't in my room anymore. They had fumigated the room, but they had tossed out all my toys. They'd taken out all my possessions because they said they're all contaminated. And so, we couldn't have them. It's like, that's no fun. So I understand. And so in the house here, as we're practicing, hand washing and buying groceries, and how do you get contaminated packages of groceries into your house without getting contaminated, and how to do that. There's a very helpful little video on that, but maybe you've seen it, as to how to get your groceries unpacked and into your house in a safe way that you're not picking up the virus. I understand that. I do, yeah. And I find too, I understand the angst. During the war, the V1s were one thing. You could hear them coming. You could see what direction they were going. Fine. Wasn't fine where it dropped. But then something started happening some months later, maybe a year later. It was the V2s. And they were jet propelled, and you could not hear them coming. You could only hear them coming when they fell and exploded. Then you heard them coming. They flew faster than the speed of sound. And when they fell, they created a huge explosion, a huge amount of damage. And one fell near a house, and the ceiling cracked in the dining room. And my dad said, the children need now to evacuate. And that's when my brothers and I were evacuated back to Herefordshire, away from the bombing, for quite a while, until near the end of the war. So I understand, you can't see the coronavirus. It's too small. And even if someone is positive, they don't know they're positive. They can be a carrier for several days before they have symptoms. And it's kind of this stealth thing that you don't know, and they don't know. And so what precautions do we take as we're out and as we're in? Yeah, I get it.
How do you pray these days?
You really want to know? Okay.
Oh, yeah,
All right.
I didn't ask you this before.
No, you didn't.
So I don't know what the answer is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Quite a few years ago, I was already doing floor exercises in the morning. I used to have back trouble. And one of my family doctors said, I want to know why you have back trouble and why the stress in your body goes to your back and not somewhere else. And they found I had a curvature, the spine, right? And he said, we're going to give you some exercises to straighten and to strengthen the muscles in there. Because he says the muscles get really tight. And he says, that's what's causing all this terrible pain. You don't have a lot, he says, you don't have a lot of deterioration in the spine. Some people with a lot more trouble than you have don't have any pain. Some of the less do, so it's inconclusive, but we give you floor exercises. I says, well, how long do I have to do them? He says, till you die. He says, okay. So I've been doing those for years, right? And you kind of count to make sure you don't do too many or too few, right? And as I was doing it one day, God said to me, why don't you pray the numbers? I said, pray the numbers. And so I thought, okay. So it's like 1 through 10. And I thought of different stories that go with each number, like God is one, our Father, God is one. And then 2 is like the mission of God, the intentions of God is that we will not just learn to love God and know God, but that we will also relate to others. And Jesus sent people out 2 by 2. And 3 is the Trinity, and how the Trinity is at work helping us as we are learning to love God, but also as we're moving outward. And 4, and so forth and so on. So after a while then, I began to realize that the Lord's Prayer also carries this. And so as I pray, as I do my floor exercises in the morning, I take quite a bit of time doing it, sometimes 40 minutes or whatever. But I'm praying the numbers, but also through the lens of the Lord's Prayer. And as I do, I take this kind of geographical walk in my prayer and pray for the persons that God has laid and given me to carry in my heart. Boger Chapel and you all, and a lot of the people that are listening in here are all part of my prayer. So you get prayed for every day. And so as I do this walk, and in the last couple of days, Jesus says, I'm walking with you. And it's like then I bring the village of the people in various countries and states and towns and places. I bring you to Jesus, and for Jesus to tend whatever is going on, and especially now. That's how I pray.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. Is there anything, I'm going to open it up for some conversation back and forth. Is there anything that you've been wanting to say that you haven't had a chance to say?
Not at this time.
Okay. So let's have some conversation if folks want to do that. So if your video is showing, raise your hand and unmute. And if your video is not showing, you'll just have to shout out. But we'll see if we can not shout out over each other. Does anyone want to start the conversation with a question or a comment or? Silence. Silence is good. Is that Angie raising her hand? Angie.
Hi, Wendy.
Hey.
That gave me chills when you said you're taking us with you to Jesus. I literally got chills. Thank you so much for including us in your prayers.
It's kind of like there is this dispersed village scattered in many places that I tend in various ways. And so it's like I bring this dispersed village to Jesus, or invite him to visit the village, right? Just like he did in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And attend each one or each group as he does. So yeah.
Thank you.
Diane, did you have your hand up?
So today we go to the grocery store and we experience the fact that a lot of the shelves are empty. Mm-hmm. And we can't find the things that we think we have to have. Mm-hmm. But during that period of time, you were experiencing something much more severe in the form of rationing.
Yes, we were. Everyone had a ration book. Children had one, single people had one, parents had one. And in that ration book, and just during, I think during World War II, that was also true here in the United States. And certain things were rationed. And so there were pages in there, and there were these little squares that would get torn out. And you'd have your ration of sugar, and your ration of cheese, and your ration of whatever it was. And what was especially lacking, because we could not get it, was things like fresh fruits and vegetables, butter, eggs, sometimes fresh meat. This is where spam became very popular, canned spam. And so I remember how hungry I became as a child for fresh fruit and vegetables. And then sugar was also a deal, because in England, it's just assumed that everybody drinks British tea with milk in it, and you drink it. And as children, you drink it, right? And I was in the kind of home where it's expected you drink it. And I had to put 2 teaspoons of sugar in there to kind of sweeten the ante so I could get this stuff down. And so it meant sugar. But yeah, I think what I find is, I thought of that as I was thinking about the coronavirus, because Ed and I don't go to the store anymore. We're over 60, so nope, we don't go. But Heidi and Gary do. But early on, you could not find toilet tissue. And various other things you just can't find. Heidi came up with a brilliant idea of getting these little white knit cloths at Lowe's. You can buy them in a package of about 12, and they're about 12 inches by maybe 7, and they're double. They're stitched around the edge. They're white, and she got several packages. And anytime we wash our hands, we use that to dry them. And we can also use it to wipe off the sink surface or whatever. And then we put it in a little basket. And once a day, we wash those things. So we don't use paper towels. We don't use a hand towel all the time because hand towels get grungy. And we're trying to really do the clean thing. Then we figure if we finally run out of toilet tissue and have to use paper towels, which we have in the bathroom, we don't have to, we have paper towels. So I hear you, I do. Rationing was a thing, it really was, yeah.
Tell the story of your mother and your saving sugar.
Oh, my mother was very clever. She knew how to economize because she had also lived through World War I. And so she would give each of us children a jar, a glass jar with a lid, and she put our sugar ration in there, which was 4 ounces per week. That was the sugar. So that's like half a cup, right? And she said, now see how much you can have over at the end of the week. So it was a little contest going, right? And he was older than I was. He always won because he didn't need as much sugar in his cornflakes or in his tea. And I always had sugar on my cornflakes and in my tea. So he always won. But it was always sugar over. Then she'd take that sugar and put it in another container and give us our ration again the next week. That went all the way through until we were evacuated and then afterwards. And with that extra sugar then, she had sugar for cakes. So she baked a cake once a week for Sundays, for tea, Christmas cakes, birthday cakes, Easter cakes, mince pies. So she always had enough to celebrate.
Also, so keeping space to celebrate.
Keep space to celebrate, yes.
Celebrate.
Yeah, it was special.
Yeah. All right. Any others?
Yeah.
Hello, folks. Nice to see you.
Hey, I need to introduce this person. This is Gail Graham, who lives in Plaster Rock, New Brunswick, Canada, home of the World Pond Hockey Ice Championships.
Gary loves them.
I love, and she's
20 years,
probably
20
my
years
third.
next year, Gary.
I know. I need to get that back there. I think Gail is my third cousin, twice removed, and we are close. And I mean that. Although I haven't seen her in a few years, but it's so good to see you, Gail. So
You too, and enjoying it very much. Your talk about being in England and growing up is very, very interesting. Thank you.
Welcome, Gail.
Did you were going to ask something, Gail?
Well, I just want to tell you how much I enjoyed it and your talk about your faith and how it all, through your grandparents and whatnot, very interesting.
Thank you, Gail.
Making me cry.
Me too. Other folks. Hey, Scott, can I pick on you? You have anything to say to your mom?
Hi, Mom.
Hi, Scott.
So, just and hi, Vicky too. Wanted to ask, can you tell some more about the story of you were evacuated from London, and then you were all separated from your parents then, and then talk about what happened after that, about where you moved from after being evacuated. Kind of what seemed like you would be moving further away from the war, but you ended up being moved towards the war. So if you can talk about that.
Apparently, from what I understand, there was a media silence toward the end of the war. And part of it, I understand, was about the secrecy of all the Allied troops, literally all poised to leave England and sail across the ocean to break through the German lines all along the European coast. And they actually camouflaged in very, very many different ways. So even if German planes flew over, they would never see all these trucks and everything else. And so there was a news blackout. And so the persons we were staying with, the Jacksons, Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, she wrote to my mother and she said, seems all quiet and everything's quiet now. Why don't you come and get the children? And instead of writing back and saying, well, it's much worse than you think, my mother came to get us. And so we came back on the train then from Herefordshire to London. And I remember that we got off the train and I remember we walked through the city because we passed a grocery store, and in the window I saw a banana. I had never seen a banana in my life. And I said, what is that? And my mother said, that's a banana. Can we have one? And we're not now. So we just walked on, right? That's the only thing I remember about London at that time. So we traveled on down to Eastbourne where her parents lived, her mother and her stepmother, because her dad married again because her mother died. Stepfather, no, my stepmother.
Oh, your stepmother. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And her name was Winnie, and she was a wonderful, wonderful step-grandma. She was wonderful. We stayed with them for a few months because we didn't have a place to live. And that was my mother and my two brothers and I. My dad was still in London. And then we found a flat or an apartment not too far from the train station in Eastbourne on the 3rd floor. And across the road from a park. And what we didn't know as children was, we never knew either, that actually we were in this kind of waiting mode of this invasion. And if the invasion didn't go right, I mean, we would be in real trouble. We were right on the coast. And so in Eastbourne was also the city that was the most bombed city on the South Coast. The planes would come over and bomb, and then on their way back, they would drop all their spares on Eastbourne. And they also wanted to pound Eastbourne really badly in order to discourage the people from ever thinking that anything good could happen. So Eastbourne was very ravaged in the war. So yes, we were walking back into the sense to the eye of the storm that was very quiet. Mm. And my uncles were a part of the war effort, and they were also part of the forces that went over them. So yes, Scott, that's how it was. I'm very, very grateful that finally the lines were broken through and the war ended. And it was only later that it kind of hit me pretty hard that we were living in a dangerous place and the war hadn't ended yet. And it didn't end until I was 7. Yeah.
Wendy, I have a question. And you just recently published a book called Holy Living, Simplicity, which I was writing my dissertation as you were writing that book. So we were writing together. So we were both miserable together. And you used to joke that, boy, simplicity is a complex subject.
That's right.
And well, how does simplicity, how might you relate to what you were writing about in that book to how we are right now? And I know that's a huge question, but is there something you can say about that?
Part of it is the coronavirus and what's really, really important. You know, things begin to look very different when the huge values of people's health and well-being and our safety and how really are you is so important, and worship together becomes different when we gather. It's deeper, and we appreciate being together even though we're scattered. And I'm so glad that other people have joined us as to become part of the coronavirus family with Boger's Chapel, right? We're all in that family. And it's like, and then things don't seem quite as important until you don't have toilet tissue, right? But the other thing I find as I get older, and we've moved quite a bit recently, is that I just don't need as much stuff. I just don't. And so part of being home now, what is it? Physical distancing, not social distancing, it's physical distancing, is that we have time and space to say, oh, let's go through this box, or let's go through these shelves, or let's go through our books, and what do we want to divest? The sad news is that Goodwill is no longer receiving anything right now, so we have to find a place to park it. But we are thinning down. Part of it's age, part of it is a realization that how we are with each other is so much more important than stuff.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Wendy.
Oh, well, thank
And,
you
yeah.
for inviting me.
I'm going to stop the recording.